The smell of industrial bleach couldn't mask the copper tang of blood. They looked at her faded scrubs and saw a glorified waitress with a stethoscope. They didn't know those hands had held together shattered arteries in Kandahar. To them, she was just a nurse. Until the doors blew open, the fluorescent lights of St. Jude's emergency department buzzed with a low, psychotic hum. It was 3 a.m. on a Saturday, the hour when the city vomited its worst mistakes into Trauma Bay 1. Clara stood over a steel sink, scrubbing dried blood out from under her fingernails with a bristled brush. Her back ached, a deep, persistent throb at the base of her spine. 12 hours into a 14-hour shift. The coffee had stopped working at midnight. Now she was running entirely on adrenaline and spite. "Bed 4 needs a bedpan," a voice drifted past her. Clara didn't look up. She kept scrubbing. The water ran pink down the drain. "Clara, are you deaf?" She turned off the tap, dried her hands on a rough paper towel, and turned. Dr. Richard Hayes stood in the doorway, a tablet tucked under his arm, his pristine white coat unbothered by the chaos around them. Hayes was a second-year attending physician who wore his medical degree like a crown. He was technically proficient, academically brilliant, and completely useless when the floor turned into a meat grinder. "I'm resetting Bay 1, Clara said, her voice flat. "Housekeeping is backed up. If we don't mop the blood, the next patient slips. Have an orderly get the bedpan." "The orderlies are busy," Hayes said, checking his watch. "And Bed 4 is Mrs. Langdon, Board of Directors Langdon. She came in with a migraine and wants to be comfortable while we wait for her MRI results. Get her a warm blanket and a bedpan. Now." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. He had soft hands, hands that had never had to clamp a severed femoral artery in the dark. "We have 3 gunshot wounds en route from the warehouse district," Clara said, stepping past him into the hallway. The ER was a war zone. Gurneys lined the walls. Monitors shrieked. The smell of sweat, vomit, and iodine hung thick in the air. "I am the senior trauma nurse on this floor. I am prepping the massive transfusion protocol. Tell the board member to hold it." Hayes grabbed her arm. It was a mistake. Clara's muscles went rigid, a ghost reaction from a life she had buried deeply. She looked down at his fingers on her scrub top, then up at his face. Her eyes were dead, flat, and cold. Hayes blinked, a sudden, inexplicable shiver of intimidation running up his spine. He let go. "You don't dictate triage, Clara," Hayes snapped, lowering his voice to keep the argument contained. "You follow orders. That's the hierarchy. You're a nurse. You execute the care plan I create. Now, I'm telling you to attend to the VIP." "She's a migraine," Clara said, turning her back on him and walking toward the blood bank cooler. "Give her 50 milligrams of sumatriptan and a dark room. I have actual dying people to worry about." She grabbed 4 units of O-negative blood, logging them out with rapid, practiced keystrokes. When she returned to the trauma bays, the double doors of the ambulance bay blew open. The paramedics rolled in fast, their boots squeaking wildly on the linoleum. "John Doe, mid-20s, multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen." The lead medic yelled over the din. "BP is 70/40 and dropping. Heart rate 140. He's crashing." Clara was moving before the gurney locked into place. "On my count. 1, 2, 3. They transferred the bleeding mass of flesh onto the trauma bed. Clara didn't see a person. She saw a kinetic puzzle. She saw the mechanics of dying and how to reverse them. Her hands moved in a blur. Heavy trauma shears sliced through the man's bloody t-shirt, exposing a chest peppered with entry wounds. Dr. Hayes stepped up to the head of the bed, snapping on gloves. "All right, let's get a central line. Push epi, someone get me an airway." "He doesn't need an airway yet. His trachea is mid-line and he's moving air," Clara said, slapping a massive hydrogel dressing over a sucking chest wound. "He needs volume and he needs a chest tube. Right side. He's got no breath sounds." "I am running this code," Hayes barked, grabbing a laryngoscope. "Push paralytics. I'm intubating." Clara stopped. She looked at the monitor. The oxygen saturation was dropping, not because he wasn't breathing, but because his right lung had collapsed under the pressure of pooled blood and air. If Hayes paralyzed him to shove a tube down his throat, the sudden drop in intrathoracic pressure would stop his heart instantly. "Doctor," Clara said, her voice cutting through the panic of the room like a scalpel. "If you push propofol and paralyze him, he will code. Put a tube in his chest right now." Hayes glared at her, his ego bruising in real time in front of the residents and medics. "Push the drugs, Clara." She didn't move. She stared him down across the bleeding chest of the dying man. "I said push the damn drugs!" Hayes yelled. "You are just a nurse! Do your job!" The trauma bay fell dead silent, save for the frantic, erratic beeping of the heart monitor. The junior nurses looked terrified. The respiratory therapist stood frozen with a bag valve mask in her hands. Clara looked at the syringe of paralytic on the metal tray. She looked at the patient's neck. The jugular veins were distended, bulging against the skin. Tension pneumothorax. It was textbook. It was lethal. "No," Clara said. Hayes's face went purple. "What did you say to me?" "I am refusing the order," Clara said, her voice devoid of emotion. She reached down, completely bypassing the medication tray. Her hand closed around a 14-gauge needle. "You are killing him. Step back." "I will have your license for this," Hayes screamed, lunging across the bed to physically block her. "Security! Get her out of here!" Clara didn't flinch. She leaned into Hayes's space, dropping her center of gravity, and drove her shoulder into his chest, just hard enough to knock him off balance. As he stumbled backward into a rolling tray, Clara stepped forward. She didn't hesitate. She didn't measure. Muscle memory, built in the dust and blood of foreign deserts, took over. She slammed the massive needle into the second intercostal space of the patient's right chest. A loud, violent hiss echoed in the room, followed immediately by a spray of atomized blood. The trapped air escaped under pressure. Instantly, the man's chest fell into a normal rhythm. On the screen, the heart rate ticked down from 150 to 110. The blood pressure started to climb. Clara tossed the bloody needle into the sharps container and grabbed a scalpel and a plastic chest tube. "He's stabilized. I'm prepping for the tube. Call surgery. Tell them we have a bleeder in the abdomen." The room was stunned. The junior nurses scrambled to follow her commands, completely ignoring the spluttering attending physician. Hayes stood against the wall, chest heaving. He wiped a spot of blood off his immaculate white coat. His eyes were venomous. He didn't see a life saved. He saw an insubordinate subordinate. "You're done," Hayes whispered, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You are fired. I am going to the chief of staff right now. You will never work in medicine again." Clara didn't look up from her work. She sutured the heavy plastic tube to the patient's skin, tying tight, precise knots. "Make sure you spell my name right on the write-up, Richard. It's Clara. 20 minutes later, the patient was wheeled up to surgery, alive. Clara stood at the sink, washing her hands again. The water ran pink. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the crushing weight of the shift. She knew Hayes wasn't bluffing. She had openly defied a doctor, physically pushed him, and performed an invasive surgical procedure outside her scope of practice as a civilian nurse. The medical board would eat her alive. She dried her hands and leaned her forehead against the cool mirror of the staff bathroom. She looked at her reflection. Deep bags under grey eyes, hair pulled back in a messy, severe bun, a faded scar running along her jawline. "Why do you do this?" she asked herself. She could have stayed in. She could have retired with a pension. But she wanted to save lives without carrying a rifle. She wanted a normal, quiet life in a normal, loud hospital. But bureaucracy, ego, and the rigid hierarchy of civilian medicine were suffocating her. She walked out of the bathroom and headed back to the nurses' station. Hayes was already there, flanked by the hospital's night administrator and 2 armed security guards. "There she is," Hayes said, his voice dripping with vindication. The administrator, a tired-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, sighed. "Clara, Dr. Hayes has filed a formal complaint. Assault, insubordination, and operating outside your license. You need to hand over your badge and clear out your locker. We are placing you on unpaid suspension pending a board review." Clara looked at the security guards. Both of them looked apologetic. They knew her. They liked her. "He was going to paralyze attention pneumothorax," Clara said simply. "The patient would have coded in 10 seconds. "That is a clinical judgment for the physician to make," the administrator said rigidly. "You are a nurse. Your job is to facilitate, not dictate. Badge, now." Clara slowly reached up and unclipped her ID badge. She placed it on the counter. The plastic clicked against the laminate. "You're a glorified maid with a degree, Clara," Hayes sneered, stepping closer. "You clean up the mess. You don't make the calls. Don't ever forget your place." Clara stared at him. She felt the sudden, burning urge to break his nose, to show him exactly what her hands were capable of when they weren't healing. But she just breathed out. A long, slow exhale. "Good luck, Richard," she said softly. "Try not to kill anyone before shift change." She turned to walk toward the locker room. Then the hospital shuddered. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythmic, heavy thudding, vibrating through the concrete floors and rattling the glass of the medication cabinets. Thwack, 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 thwack. Clara stopped. Her blood ran cold. She knew that sound. It was the heavy rotor wash of a Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter, and it sounded like it was landing directly on the hospital roof. The PA system crackled to life, but instead of the normal operator, a frantic, high-pitched voice screamed over the speakers. Code black in the ER. We have unauthorized entry. Security to the roof. Security to..." The transmission cut to static. The ER froze. Patients peeked out from behind curtains. Hayes looked at the ceiling, the smugness evaporating from his face, replaced by genuine confusion. The security guards reached for their radios, but all they got was a wall of heavy electronic jamming static. "What is going on?" the administrator demanded. Clara didn't speak. She stepped back from the nurse's station, moving instinctively to the structural pillar in the center of the room. She kept her back to the concrete, her eyes scanning the primary and secondary exits. The civilian in her was suspended. The operator was awake. Heavy, synchronized bootsteps echoed from the main stairwell. Fast, tactical, moving with purpose. The double-reinforced doors of the stairwell didn't just open, they were violently breached. 6 men poured into the emergency room. They weren't police. They weren't SWAT. They wore sterile, unmarked tactical gear. No police patches, no FBI insignia, just solid grey and black armour. They carried short-barreled rifles, kept meticulously at the low ready. Night vision mounts sat on their helmets. Radios whispered through earpieces. They moved with a fluid, terrifying lethality. Within 3 seconds, 2 men had secured the ambulance bay doors. 2 men held the hallway leading to the main hospital, and 2 stepped directly into the center of the ER. Panic erupted. A nurse screamed. Patients ducked behind beds. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," the point man barked. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a calibrated command that cut through the hysteria like a whip. "Keep your hands visible. Nobody moves." Hayes, paralyzed by shock, raised his hands, his clipboard clattering to the floor. What is this? This is a hospital. You can't be here." The squad leader ignored him. He was a mountain of a man, his face partially obscured by a balaclava and heavy communication gear. His eyes swept the room, scanning faces, ignoring the doctors, ignoring the security guards. He was looking for someone specific. Behind them, the elevator doors chimed and slid open. 2 more operators backed out, dragging a collapsible tactical litter. On the litter was a man in identical gear, his armor stripped away, his abdomen wrapped in blood-soaked combat gauze. He was pale, sweating profusely, and barely conscious. "We need a trauma bay, clear it out," the leader ordered, gesturing to Bay 1. Hayes stepped forward, his arrogance momentarily overriding his survival instinct. "You can't just storm in here. This is a sterile environment. Who is your commanding officer? I demand to..." One of the operators didn't even look at Hayes. He simply raised a heavy, armored forearm and shoved the doctor backward. Hayes hit the floor hard, sliding on the slick linoleum. The squad leader stepped past him, His eyes locked onto the concrete pillar. He saw her. Clara stepped out from behind the pillar. She didn't have her hands up. She stood perfectly relaxed, perfectly still. The squad leader stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered his rifle, letting it hang on its sling. He reached up and pulled down his balaclava. He had a thick, jagged scar over his left eye. "Miller," Clara said softly. Her voice barely carried over the noise, but he heard it. "Captain David Miller, United States Army Special Operations Command," locked eyes with the woman in the faded scrubs. The woman who had just been fired. The woman Dr. Hayes had called a glorified maid. Miller snapped to rigid attention. His boots clicked together. "Room!" Miller roared, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "Attention!" In perfect, terrifying unison, the 6 armed operators in the room shifted. Rifles slapped against armor. Boots cracked. Every single one of them stopped what they were doing, turned toward Clara, and stood at absolute, rigid military attention. The silence in the ER was absolute. The only sound was the raspy breathing of the wounded man on the litter. Hayes, still sitting on the floor, stared in open-mouthed horror. The administrator had gone completely pale. The security guards slowly lowered their hands, utterly bewildered. Miller raised his hand in a crisp, sharp salute. "Major," Miller said, his voice thick with an absolute, unwavering reverence. "We're sorry to bypass protocol, ma'am, but we took a casualty on a domestic op. The bleeding won't stop. The military hospital was 10 minutes too far." Clara looked at the men. She looked at the bloody litter. She looked down at Hayes, who was staring at her as if she had suddenly grown wings. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a fresh pair of trauma gloves, and snapped them onto her hands. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Stand down, Captain," Clara said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute authority. "Get him into Bay 1. I need massive transfusion protocol, O negative. Now." "Yes, ma'am," Miller barked. Clara walked past Dr. Hayes without a second glance. "Get out of my way, Richard. I have a mess to clean up." Trauma Bay 1 smelled of bleach, iron, and the sharp chemical tang of combat gauze. Clara stood over the metal gurney, the overhead surgical lights casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across the room. The casualty, a young operator with the name tape Gomez velcroed to his rig, was bleeding to death. The armor had stopped the shrapnel from entering his chest cavity, but a high-velocity round had slipped under the Kevlar plating, tearing through his lower left quadrant. The civilian nurses were frozen. The respiratory therapist stood pinned against the wall, her eyes wide, staring at the 6 heavily armed men who had just turned her hospital into a forward operating base. "I need hands!" Clara barked, her voice cracking like a whip. "I don't care if you're terrified, I need hands right now. Sarah, get on the rapid infuser, hook up the O negative, squeeze the bags, do it now." Sarah, a junior nurse who had been crying in the break room 2 hours ago, jolted at the command. She scrambled to the IV pole, her trembling hands fumbling with the blood bags. "Hayes," Clara said, not looking up as she dragged heavy shears down the center of Gomez's tactical pants, exposing the catastrophic wound. "You want to be a doctor? Stand at the head of the bed. Manage his airway. If he aspirates, I will personally break your jaw." Hayes didn't argue. He didn't cite protocol. The sight of Captain Miller's hand resting casually on the pistol grip of his rifle completely vaporized the attending physician's ego. Hayes scurried to the headboard, grabbing the suction catheter and a bag valve mask, his pristine white coat brushing against the dirt and blood of the operator's gear. Clara looked at the wound. It was a mess. The bullet had cavitated, turning the soft tissue of the abdomen into a pulverized cavern. Blood was welling up thick and fast, a dark rhythmic pulsing that meant arterial involvement. "Pressure is tanking," Miller said. He had stepped up to the opposite side of the bed, his rifle slung, his gloved hands ready. He didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like a scrub tech who had done this 100 times in the dark. "He's lost at least 2 liters on the bird." "He's bleeding out from the mesenteric artery or the descending aorta," Clara said, her fingers probing the slick, hot ruin of Gomez's abdomen. She couldn't find the bleeder. There was too much blood. "Suction! I need suction in here, now!" Another operator, a tall man with a radio strapped to his chest, grabbed the plastic Yankauer suction tip and jammed it into the wound, clearing a momentary pool of blood. It filled back up instantly. "It's not enough," Clara muttered. She glanced at the monitor. Blood pressure was 60 over palpation, heart rate 160. He was emptying his vascular system onto the floor. "He's going to code. I need to cross-clamp the aorta." Hayes dropped the suction tube. "You can't do a thoracotomy. You are not a surgeon, Clara. This is a civilian hospital. You have to wait for the surgical team." "The surgical team is 20 minutes away, Richard," Clara said, her voice dropping into a terrifying, dead calm. "He has 2 minutes. Scalpel." She held out her hand. Sarah stared at the tray, paralyzed. Captain Miller reached over, grabbed the number 10 scalpel from the sterile field, and slapped it firmly into Clara's palm. Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the medical board, the hospital administrators, or the sheer, undeniable insanity of performing a clamshell thoracotomy in an emergency room bay. She thought about the 22-year-old kid bleeding out on her table. She pressed the blade to the left side of Gomez's chest, right between the 4th and 5th ribs, and pulled it sharply across his sternum. Hayes turned away, gagging. The administrator, watching from the hallway through the glass doors, actually fainted, sliding down the wall into a crumpled heap. Clara dropped the scalpel and grabbed a pair of heavy rib spreaders. "Miller, get in here. Crank this open. Do not stop until I tell you." Miller wedged the metal retractors into the bloody incision. With a grunt of effort, he cranked the handle. Bone cracked, cartilage tore, the chest cavity opened, exposing the beating, frantic heart and the deflated lungs. Clara plunged her hands into the chest cavity. The heat of the man's internal organs radiated against her wrists. She bypassed the heart, reaching deep toward the spine. She navigated entirely by touch, feeling through the slick tissue and pooling blood. Come on, come on. Her fingers found it. The thick, rubbery tube of the descending aorta. "DeBakey clamp," Clara snapped. The tall operator handed her the long, angled surgical clamp. Clara guided it down the length of her own hand, feeling the jaws frame the artery. She squeezed. The metal ratchets clicked into place. Instantly, the bleeding in Gomez's abdomen slowed from a torrential flood to a sluggish seep. On the monitor, the blood pressure spiked. 80 over 50, 90 over 60. By clamping the aorta, she had completely cut off blood flow to the lower half of his body, forcing whatever blood he had left into his heart and brain. It bought him time. It bought him life. But a ticking clock had just started. "Clamp is secure," Clara breathed, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "We have 20 minutes before his kidneys and legs die from ischemia." "Sarah, call the OR. Tell Dr. Harrison to prep for an exploratory laparotomy with vascular repair. Tell him the aorta is cross-clamped in the ER." Sarah nodded frantically, grabbing the wall phone. Clara looked down at Gomez. His face was grey, slack, and covered in a sheen of cold sweat. But his chest was rising and falling. He was alive. She kept her hand inside his chest, holding the clamp steady, feeling the frantic mechanical thud of his heart against her knuckles. It was a familiar feeling. It was a feeling she had chased across 3 continents, a feeling that had cost her 2 marriages, her youth, and a comfortable retirement. "He's stable," Clara said softly. Miller leaned over the bed. He looked at Gomez, then looked up at Clara. His eyes, framed by the harsh overhead lights, were wet. "Thank you, Doc." "Don't call me that, David," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the monitor. "I'm not a doctor. I'm just a nurse." Miller offered a faint, bitter smile. "You're Major Clara Wyatt. You ran the most productive forward surgical team in the Korengal Valley. You put more of my guys back together than God himself. You can wear whatever scrubs you want, ma'am. You're still Doc." Before Clara could answer, the double doors of the ER blew open again. This time, it was a civilian army. Dr. Harrison, the chief of surgery, rushed in, flanked by 2 anesthesiologists, 3 scrub nurses, and a surgical resident. Harrison was a veteran himself, an old-school trauma surgeon with a reputation for a vicious temper and brilliant hands. He stopped at the foot of the bed, taking in the scene. He saw the armed operators. He saw Dr. Hayes cowering near the sink. He saw the massive pool of blood on the floor. And then he saw Clara, her hands buried in the open chest of a heavily tattooed man. Harrison didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations about protocol or unauthorized procedures. He looked at the monitor, saw the clamped aorta, and understood the math immediately. "Good catch, Clara," Harrison said, snapping on sterile gloves as he walked toward the gurney. "I've got the clamp. Let's move him to OR3. We have 16 minutes to fix the leak before he loses his legs. Let's roll." Clara didn't let go immediately. She waited until Harrison slid his hands into the chest cavity, his fingers wrapping around the metal clamp. Only then did she step back. The military operators stepped out of the way seamlessly, allowing the surgical team to take over. The gurney unlocked. The wheels squeaked against the blood-slicked floor. In a flurry of motion and shouted commands, Gomez was rushed out of the trauma bay and down the hall toward the surgical elevators. Then the bay was empty. Just Clara, Dr. Hayes, Captain Miller, and a room that looked like a slaughterhouse. The adrenaline left Clara's body like a receding tide, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her bones. She stood in the center of the bay, staring at the empty floor. Blood was everywhere. It painted the walls, pooled in the grout of the tiles, and smeared across the steel counters. She turned slowly and walked to the sink. She stepped on the foot pedal. The water ran cold. She thrust her hands under the stream, watching the thick, coagulated blood wash away. Red turned to pink. Pink turned to clear. She grabbed the bristled brush and started scrubbing under her fingernails. Dr. Hayes finally pushed himself away from the wall. He looked completely unraveled. His perfectly styled hair was matted with sweat. His white coat was stained with a bloody handprint where an operator had shoved him. "You," Hayes stammered, his voice trembling. "You opened his chest. You sliced a man's chest open. You're a nurse. You'll go to prison for this. I'll make sure of it." Clara didn't stop scrubbing. "He's alive, Richard. If you had intubated him, or if we had waited for Harrison, he would be dead. Go write your report. Tell them exactly what happened." Captain Miller stepped between Clara and the attending physician. He didn't touch Hayes. He didn't have to. The sheer physical presence of the operator, smelling of cordite and sweat, was enough to make Hayes take a step back. "Doctor," Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly threat, "if you breathe a word of this to a medical board, if you try to take her license, I will make it my personal mission to ensure you never practice medicine outside of a veterinary clinic in Antarctica. Do we understand each other?" Hayes opened his mouth, closed it, and nodded frantically. He turned and practically ran out of the trauma bay. Miller watched him go, then turned back to Clara. She had finished washing her hands and was drying them with a rough paper towel. "You shouldn't have threatened him, David," Clara said, leaning against the sink. "I can fight my own battles." "I know you can," Miller said. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a clean, black challenge coin. He walked over and set it on the steel counter next to her. "But you shouldn't have to. Not from guys like that." Clara looked at the coin. It bore the insignia of a Tier 1 counter-terrorism unit. "What happened tonight?" Clara asked quietly. "You guys don't operate on US soil, and you definitely don't bring casualties to civilian hospitals." "A raid went bad," Miller said, his eyes darkening. "Human trafficking ring out of the port. They had heavier hardware than intel suggested. We took contact in a confined space. Gomez took a ricochet. The evac bird was grounded due to mechanical failure, and we couldn't wait for a ground ambulance. You were the closest trauma center." Clara nodded slowly. "I'm glad you brought him here." "Are you?" Miller asked, looking at her faded scrubs. "Why are you here, Doc? Why are you taking orders from a kid who looks like he's never seen a paper cut, let alone a gunshot wound? You were a major. You were the chief of trauma for the entire theater." Clara looked away, staring at the bloody floor. "Because I got tired of deciding who lived and who died," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "In the army, I had to do triage. I had to look at a room full of broken kids and decide who got the surgeon and who got the morphine. I made the calls. I gave the orders. And I carry the ghosts of every single kid I put in a black bag because I didn't have enough hands, or enough blood, or enough time. She looked back up at Miller, her grey eyes heavy with years of suppressed grief. Here, she continued, gesturing to the messy trauma bay. I don't have to make those calls. I just execute. I start the IVs. I hang the blood. I clean the wounds. I get to save them, without carrying the weight of being the one in charge. It's quiet. Or at least, it's supposed to be. Miller studied her face for a long moment. He understood. He carried his own ghosts. Every man in his unit did. For what it's worth, Miller said softly, you're a terrible subordinate. You still act like you own the room. Clara actually smiled. A small, fleeting break in the armor. I do own the room, David. They just don't know it. They do now, he replied. The tall operator with the radio stepped into the doorway. Captain, bird is spun up. Cleanup crew is on site. We need to ghost. Miller nodded. He turned back to Clara, snapping to attention one last time. He didn't salute. They were indoors, and she was a civilian now, but the respect radiating from him was palpable. Keep the coin, Doc. If you ever need us, we'll find you. Stay safe, Miller. Keep your head down. The 6 operators vanished as quickly as they had arrived. No goodbyes to the staff. No paperwork filed. They simply melted into the stairwell, and a minute later, the heavy thudding of the Black Hawk's rotors shook the building as it lifted off the roof, banking away into the dark city sky. The silence that fell over the ER was deafening. Clara walked out of the trauma bay and headed toward the nurses' station. The ER staff was slowly creeping out of the woodwork. Patients were peering through the glass. Mr. Davis, the hospital administrator, had recovered from his fainting spell. He was sitting in a chair behind the desk, holding a cold compress to his head. Dr. Hayes was standing next to him, looking thoroughly defeated. When Clara approached the desk, the entire staff stopped moving. They stared at her. The junior nurses looked at her with a mixture of terror and absolute awe. Davis cleared his throat awkwardly. Clara, I spoke with Dr. Harrison in the OR. He said the patient is stabilizing. He said your intervention was the only thing that kept him alive. Dr. Harrison is a good surgeon, Clara said neutrally. Davis looked at Hayes, then back to Clara. He rubbed the back of his neck, his corporate composure completely shattered. Regarding the earlier incident, the suspension, I think, given the extraordinary circumstances, we can consider this a misunderstanding. We will tear up the write-up. You can keep your position. Clara looked at the administrator. She looked at his cheap suit and his nervous, blinking eyes. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her plastic ID badge, and tossed it onto the counter. It clattered loudly in the quiet room. Davis blinked. Clara, I just said you aren't fired. I know, Clara said. I'm negotiating. Davis swallowed hard. Negotiating? Yes, Clara said, leaning over the counter, forcing Davis to lean back. I am the senior trauma nurse on this floor. From now on, when I call a massive transfusion protocol, the blood gets here in 2 minutes, not 5. When I tell housekeeping to mop a bay, they do it immediately, not when they finish their coffee break. She turned her gaze to Dr. Hayes. He flinched. And Richard, Clara said, her voice dripping with ice. If you ever tell me to fetch a warm blanket for a VIP while a trauma patient is bleeding in my hallway, I won't just push you. I will break your nose. Do we understand each other? Hayes nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the floor. Clara picked her badge back up and clipped it to her scrub top. She looked at the junior nurses, who were still staring at her. What are you all looking at? Clara barked, clapping her hands together. The sharp sound broke the spell. We have 3 more gunshot wounds en route from the warehouse district. Sarah, restock the chest tube kits in Bay 1. David, get the rapid infuser cleaned and primed. Let's move. The ER snapped back to life. The nurses scrambled, moving with a speed and efficiency that hadn't been seen in years. The respiratory therapist grabbed her gear. The orderlies ran to clear the hallways. Clara walked back toward the sinks. Her back still ached. She was still exhausted. The coffee was still useless. She turned on the tap and started washing her hands. The water ran clear. She looked up at her reflection in the mirror. She saw the grey eyes. She saw the faded scar. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't just see a tired nurse hiding from the world. She saw Doc, and Doc still had work to do. Clara's actions saved a life and shattered the arrogant hierarchy of her ER, proving that true authority isn't granted by a name badge. It is forged in the grueling fires of experience. The hospital board quietly shredded the complaints, and Clara returned to her post, not just as a nurse, but as the undeniable, commanding heartbeat of the trauma floor. Did Clara's story give you chills? Hit that like button, share this video to respect our silent heroes, and subscribe.